Welcome, dear listeners, to a delightful journey back to the charming English village of St. Mary Mead in the tranquil post-war years. Settle in with a cup of tea as we join the inimitable Miss Jane Marple, that gentle elderly lady with the sharpest mind in all of detective fiction. In this cozy tale inspired by the classic style of Agatha Christie, we uncover secrets hidden beneath the roses and teacups. Allow yourself to be enveloped in the warm community spirit, the gentle wit, and the intellectual puzzle of Miss Marple and the Summer Fete Murder. And now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Delightful Day of the Fete. The summer sun hung high over the idyllic village of St. Mary Mead, bathing the rolling meadows and flower-strewn lanes in a soft golden light that seemed to whisper promises of endless afternoons. It was the mid-1950s, a time when the scars of war had begun to fade like old ink on a well-thumbed letter, and the villagers clung to their traditions with the quiet determination of those who had learned to cherish the familiar. The air was alive with the hum of bees in the lavender hedges and the distant trill of a blackbird. But today, those gentle sounds were overshadowed by the cheerful clamor of the annual summer fete. The village green, that expansive patch of velvet turf ringed by ancient oaks and the sturdy stone walls of the parish church, had been transformed into a riot of color and activity. Stalls of every description sprouted like wildflowers after a rain. The white elephant stall, presided over by the vicar's wife with her perpetual smile and a table groaning under the weight of forgotten treasures. Faded porcelain figurines, dog-eared novels, and a peculiar brass candlestick that no one could quite place. Nearby, the home produce tent billowed like a sail in the breeze, its canvas sides heavy with the scent of sun-ripened strawberries, golden jars of gooseberry jam, and plump Victoria sponges crowned with dollops of cream that defied the rationing still lingering in memory. Laughter bubbled from the coconut shy, where strapping young men from the local farm rolled up their sleeves and hurled wooden balls with more enthusiasm than accuracy, much to the delight of the cluster of giggling schoolgirls who cheered them on. Children, their faces sticky with toffee apples, darted between the legs of adults, pursuing the elusive thrill of the lucky dip or the dizzying spin of the hoopla. In one corner, a maypole stood tall, its ribbons fluttering like the banners of some medieval tournament, and a gaggle of little ones twisted and turned in a merry dance under the watchful eye of Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, who clapped her hands with the vigor of a sergeant major. The brass band, seated beneath the spreading branches of the great oak that had shaded generations of fete-goers, struck up a lively rendition of Jerusalem, their tuba player puffing out his cheeks with such gusto that his mustache seemed to quiver in time with the melody. The notes floated across the green, mingling with the sizzle of sausages on the barbecue spit and the contented sighs of those who had already claimed their spots on the hay bales seating for the afternoon's entertainment. At the heart of it all sat Miss Jane Marple, that dear, fluffy-haired old lady whose presence was as much a fixture of St. Mary Mead as the church spire itself. She had chosen a spot near the tea tent, a spacious marquee of white canvas adorned with bunting in the village colors of blue and gold. A deck chair cradled her slight frame, and in her lap lay a neat pile of knitting, a soft blue cardigan for her nephew's little girl, the needles clicking rhythmically like the ticking of some internal clock that measured not time, but the subtle shifts in human behavior. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as the points of those needles, darted hither and thither, missing nothing. The way young Gladys from the dairy blushed when the postman handed her a program, or how old Mr. Peterson from the forge paused to wipe his brow before slipping a shilling into the collection box for the church roof fund. Miss Marple had always found the summer fete a most instructive affair. Human nature, she often said to her nephew Raymond, that clever writer who visited from London, is much like a garden. It flourishes best when tended with care, but left unchecked, The weeds of envy and spite can choke the blooms. And oh, how the weeds had sprouted this year, all circling one particularly thorny bush, Mr. Reginald Harrington. The fete, as in years past, was orchestrated with military precision by Mrs. Clarissa Bantry, wife of Colonel Arthur Bantry of Gossington Hall. Dolly Bantry, as she was affectionately known, was a woman of ample proportions and even ampler enthusiasms, her round face flushed with the triumph of a job well done. She flitted from stall to stall like a butterfly in a rose garden, adjusting tablecloths and dispensing compliments with the generosity of one who believed that praise was the best fertilizer for community spirit. "It's all for the church roof, you know," she would beam, her voice carrying over the din. "That old slate's leaking like a sieve after last winter's storms. We simply must patch it before the swallows return." But this year's fete boasted an extra sparkle, a jewel in the crown of the afternoon's proceedings, the judging of the best bloom competition. The entries, a breathtaking array of nature's artistry, had been arranged in the flower tent, a grand pavilion at the green's edge, its entrance framed by arches of climbing sweet peas that perfumed the air with their delicate fragrance. There were velvety dahlias the size of saucers, their petals a symphony of crimson and gold, slender spikes of delphinium standing tall like sentinels in shades of lapis and lavender. And of course, the roses, those proud queens of the garden, their blooms unfurling like secrets long held. Presiding over this floral kingdom was Mr. Reginald Harrington, a newcomer to St. Mary Mead who had purchased the crumbling but elegant manor house on the hill just 2 summers prior. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of silver hair and a voice that boomed like thunder over the downs, Harrington cut an imposing figure. He wore a linen suit of pristine white, a straw boater tilted at a jaunty angle, and carried a magnifying glass on a ribbon about his neck, as if he were some intrepid explorer charting unknown territories rather than a retired stockbroker appraising petunias. His prize roses, hybrids he had cultivated with the zeal of a man conquering empires, had already swept the county shows, and he was not shy in reminding anyone who would listen of his triumphs. "Mediocre, at best," he had declared the previous week at the Women's Institute meeting, peering over his spectacles at Mrs. Price Ridley's entry in the local paper. "My crimson glory has twice the vigor. One must use the proper bone meal, you see, not that kitchen compost the villagers swear by." His words had stung like nettle rash, for St. Mary Mead prided itself on its gardens tended with love and passed down through families like heirlooms. Young Tom Hartley, the village gardener with his mop of chestnut curls and a temper as quick as his shears, had nearly come to blows over a similar slight when Harrington accused him of pilfering rose cuttings from the manor greenhouse. "Blown in on the wind, were they?" Harrington had scoffed. "Convenient, that." Even Miss Laura Greenshaw, the sharp-witted spinster who dwelled in her peculiar folly house amid a wilderness of heirloom bulbs, had traded barbs with him over a disputed boundary hedge. Yet for all his bluster, Harrington's purse was as open as his opinions were sharp. His donation of £50 to the church fund, a princely sum in these straitened times, had secured his role as judge, and the villagers, ever practical, had swallowed their pride with a cup of tepid tea and a forced smile. "Generous soul," Mrs. Bantry had confided to Miss Marple that morning as they unpacked crates of scones in the tea tent. "A bit of a bulldog, mind you, but one can't fault his checkbook." As the clock on the church tower struck 3, the crowd began to converge on the flower tent, a tide of sun hats and linen dresses flowing toward the canvas flaps. Children were hoisted onto shoulders for a better view, and the brass band obligingly shifted to a softer medley of waltzes. Harrington, ensconced behind a trestle table draped in damask, adjusted his boater and cleared his throat with the gravity of a Lord Chancellor. "Ladies and gentlemen of St. Mary Mead," he intoned, his voice carrying to the farthest edges of the green. "It is my distinct honor to judge this fine display. Such passion for horticulture warms the cockles, though I must say a touch more precision in pruning wouldn't go amiss." A ripple of uneasy laughter greeted this, and he pressed on, glass in hand, bending low over first one bloom then another. His commentary flowed like a river in spate. "Ah, charming, though the stems lack vigor. Adequate, but one detects a hint of aphid neglect. Passable, madam, but next year do try Epsom salts for the foliage." Miss Marple, who had wandered closer with the aid of her stout umbrella, more for balance than shade, watched with mild amusement. She noted the tightening of Mrs. Price Ridley's lips as Harrington dismissed her prize hollyhocks with a wave, and the way Captain Ainsworth, the retired naval man with his game leg and perpetual squint, gripped his program a fraction too tightly. Human nature indeed, she mused, glancing at the tea tent where servers bustled with urns and trays. A spot of refreshment might steady the nerves. Harrington reached the final entry, a magnificent display of his own roses, unentered, of course, but artfully placed as a reference. He straightened, beaming. And now, the verdict. It was then, in that suspended moment of anticipation, that disaster struck. Harrington paused, his hand fluttering to his throat as if to loosen an invisible cravat. A strange, strangled gasp escaped him, and his face, so ruddy moments before, drained to the pallor of skimmed milk. The magnifying glass slipped from his fingers, clattering against the table, and with a theatrical lurch that scattered petals like confetti, he toppled forward into the dahlia display. Blooms crushed beneath him, releasing a final, poignant whiff of sweetness. For a heartbeat, the green held its breath. Then chaos erupted. A woman's shriek pierced the air, followed by a chorus of cries. "He's fainted! Fetch the doctor! Oh, merciful heavens!" As the crowd surged forward, a press of concerned faces and outstretched hands. Dr. Haydock, the village physician who had been chatting idly with the pharmacist over a plate of cucumber sandwiches, shouldered his way through with the practiced efficiency of one accustomed to such interruptions. A wiry man in his 50s with a thatch of graying hair and spectacles perpetually askew, he knelt beside the prostrate form, his fingers swift on Harrington's wrist, then pressing to the neck. He lifted an eyelid, sniffed briefly at the fallen man's breath, and rocked back on his heels. The murmur of the crowd hushed to a collective intake. "I'm afraid it's too late," Dr. Haydock said, his voice steady but grave, rising to address the assembly. "Mr. Harrington is dead, and from the symptoms, the sudden collapse, the cyanotic tinge, it appears to be poisoning, likely ingested perhaps in something he consumed here at the fete." The words hung in the sun-dappled air like a thunderclap on a clear day. Poisoned? In St. Mary Mead? The village that prided itself on locked doors left unlocked, and neighbors who borrowed sugar without knocking. Whispers spread like ripples on a pond. But who would? Not here, surely. That tea he was sipping. Miss Marple, who had drawn nearer during the commotion, stood quietly at the tent's edge, her umbrella planted like a flag of calm amid the storm. She regarded the scene with those unflinching blue eyes, taking in the crushed flowers, the overturned judging table, and the faces of those nearest. Pale, shocked, some with hands clasped in prayer, others darting glances of uneasy speculation. Dolly Bantry hovered nearby, fanning herself with a program, her usual effervescence quelled to a tremulous whisper. "Jane. What on earth?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over her knitting bag, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, not of mirth but of that quiet recognition that comes to one who has seen life's patterns repeat across parlors and parterres alike. "Dear me," she murmured almost to herself as the first siren wailed in the distance. "How very interesting. Quite like that business in little paddocks, only with roses instead of rheumatism. One must pay attention to the roots, I always say. And so, on that golden afternoon in St. Mary Mead, beneath the watchful gaze of the ancient oak, the summer fete, that bastion of jam jars and jollity, became the stage for a mystery as intricate and unexpected as the veins on a lady's fan. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Tea Tent. The golden afternoon that had promised such innocent pleasure dissolved into a scene of quiet consternation. By 4:30, the village green looked almost forlorn, stalls half dismantled, bunting drooping, the brass band packing away their instruments with subdued murmurs. The flower tent remained cordoned off with a length of clothesline borrowed from the vicarage, and 2 young constables from Much Benham stood awkwardly beside it, as though unsure whether to salute the dahlias or arrest them. Most of the villagers had drifted reluctantly toward the tea tent. No one wished to leave entirely. The shock had bound them together in a way that only shared catastrophe can. Cups were refilled more from habit than thirst, and conversation flowed in low, urgent currents beneath the canvas roof. Miss Marple had resumed her deck chair, though her knitting lay untouched in her lap. Beside her sat Mrs. Clarissa Bantry, Dolly to her friends, fanning herself vigorously with a crumpled fête program. Her usual high color had ebbed, leaving her cheeks blotchy, and her voice, normally bright as a robin's, trembled with distress. "I simply cannot believe it, Jane," she said for the 3rd time. "Poisoned! At our little fête. Colonel Bantry will be furious when he hears. He's away at his regimental dinner, you know. And poor Mr. Harrington. Well, he was not universally beloved, but murder in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple patted her friend's arm gently. "My dear Dolly, we must not leap to conclusions. Dr. Haydock said it appeared to be poisoning, but appearances can be deceptive. Still, one cannot help noticing how many people had reason to dislike the man." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that nevertheless carried to the neighboring tables. "Dislike? That's putting it mildly. Do you know, only last week he reduced Mrs. Price Ridley to tears at the Women's Institute. Told her that her rose arrangement looked as though it had been attacked by a herd of cows, in front of everyone. And then there's young Tom Hartley. Harrington accused him of stealing rose cuttings quite publicly. Tom's a hot-headed boy. His mother was in here earlier saying he hadn't slept properly since." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Tom Hartley, 24 years old, strong and handsome in his open-necked shirt, earned his living tending the gardens of half the village. He had a quick smile for the ladies and a quicker temper when roused. The accusation of theft had stung deeply, for honesty was the one thing a village gardener could not afford to lose. "And Miss Greenshaw," continued Mrs. Bantry, warming to her theme. "You know how eccentric she is, living in that extraordinary folly of hers, surrounded by bulbs worth a small fortune. Harrington threatened to cut down her ancient yew hedge because a branch overhung his drive by 3 inches. She told him to his face, that she would see him in Hades first." Miss Marple's pale eyes twinkled faintly. Laura Greenshaw was a tall, angular woman of indeterminate age, who dressed in tweeds and stout brogues and spoke her mind with the bluntness of a billhook. Her passion for rare bulbs bordered on obsession. The threatened yew hedge had stood since the reign of Queen Anne. "Then there's Captain Ainsworth," Mrs. Bantry went on, ticking the names off on her gloved fingers. "Harrington won rather a lot of money from him at cards, £500, they say, and has been dreadfully slow about settling the debt. The captain has been looking quite haggard lately. Captain Robert Ainsworth retired from the Royal Navy after a shell splinter took part of his left leg at Narvik. Lived in a small cottage near the duck pond. He was a courteous, rather lonely man who enjoyed his whiskey and his bridge evenings. £500 was a serious sum on a naval pension." Across the tent, The subjects of this catalog sat in separate clusters, each affecting an air of dignified shock. Mrs. Price Ridley, upright in a chair near the urn, wore her best summer hat with the artificial cherries and an expression of outraged virtue. Miss Greenshaw, in an ancient Panama, stared into her teacup as though reading dire portents in the leaves. Captain Ainsworth stood by the flap of the tent, smoking a pipe and gazing toward the flower pavilion with narrowed eyes. Tom Hartley was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps wisely, thought Miss Marple. The tea tent servers, Gladys from the dairy and 2 girls from the secondary school, moved among the tables with trays of cups, their faces pale beneath their summer freckles. Gladys, a pretty, plump girl of 19, had poured Mr. Harrington's last cup of tea herself. She had already been questioned twice by the local sergeant and looked ready to burst into tears. Miss Marple beckoned her over. "Gladys, my dear, come and sit for a moment. You look quite done in." Gladys perched gratefully on a folding stool, twisting her apron in her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, it was awful. He took the cup from me not 5 minutes before he collapsed. I poured it from the big urn, same as everyone else's, but he always liked an extra spoon of sugar, he did. I gave it to him myself. Did you notice anything unusual about the cup or the tea?" Miss Marple asked gently. Gladys shook her head. "No, miss. Only, he did say it tasted a bit bitter, but he laughed and said it was probably the Indian blend Mrs. Bantry ordered this year. Then he went off to the flower tent." Mrs. Bantry bristled slightly. "There is nothing wrong with the Indian blend. It was very reasonably priced." Miss Marple smiled soothingly. "Of course not, Dolly, but bitterness might be significant if it was poison." At that moment, Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived. He was a tall, dark young man with a pleasant, intelligent face whom Miss Marple had encountered on previous occasions. He greeted her with real warmth before turning to the assembly. "I'm sorry to disturb you all," he said, raising his voice just enough to command attention. "I know this has been a dreadful shock. We're waiting for the police surgeon, but in the meantime I'd be grateful if those who were near the flower tent at the time of Mr. Harrington's collapse would remain a little longer. The rest of you may go home, but please don't leave the village without letting us know." A rustle of reluctance passed through the tent. No one truly wished to leave. The lure of unfolding drama was too strong. Chairs scraped as people settled more comfortably, pretending to finish their tea while ears strained toward every word. Miss Marple observed them all with quiet interest. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. Shock, curiosity, and a certain shameful excitement mingled in every face, and beneath it in some the faint shadow of fear, or perhaps calculation. She picked up her knitting again, the needles resuming their soft, steady click. Somewhere in this pleasant, familiar village, someone had crossed the narrow line between dislike and murder. It was her experience that the motive was rarely grand passion or greed on a dramatic scale. More often it was something small, festering, personal, a word too sharp, a slight too deep. The whispers continued around her like bees in a disturbed hive, and Miss Marple listened and watched and waited. Chapter 3. Alibis and Afternoon Calls. The following morning dawned with the gentle clarity that often follows a storm. A light mist hung over the meadows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the thatched roofs and turning the church spire into a delicate pencil sketch against the pale sky. The village, however, was anything but softened. Doors opened and closed with unusual frequency. Curtains twitched. Conversations halted abruptly when a stranger approached. The news of Mr. Harrington's death had spread like bindweed overnight, and with it the darker whisper, murder. Miss Marple took her breakfast as usual, poached egg on toast, a pot of China tea, and the Morning Post, which contained nothing more exciting than a seed catalog and a picture postcard from her nephew Raymond in Italy. She read the postcard twice, smiling at his descriptions of Roman fountains, then turned her attention to the day ahead. Experience had taught her that the first 24 hours after a crime were the most fruitful for quiet observation, before tongues grew cautious and memories conveniently blurred. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Dermot Craddock had arrived at her cottage gate, hat in hand, his dark eyes apologetic. He was a scrupulously polite young man who had learned on previous visits to St. Mary Mead that Miss Marple's apparently vague remarks were worth more than most officers' notebooks. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," he began, accepting the proffered chair in the small, sun-filled sitting room. "But I'd value your thoughts. This business at the fête, it's rather knocked us sideways." Miss Marple poured him a cup of coffee from the percolator she kept for visitors who preferred it to tea. "Not at all, Inspector. I have been thinking about it a great deal. Such a shocking thing to happen at a village fête. And yet one feels almost inevitable with Mr. Harrington." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You didn't care for him?" "I scarcely knew him," she replied mildly. "But one observes he had a talent for making enemies without seeming to notice. Tell me, what have you learned so far?" "The post-mortem is this morning, but Dr. Haydock's preliminary view is cyanide poisoning. Rapid, almost certainly ingested. Traces of bitterness were noted on the tongue. The last thing Harrington consumed was a cup of tea taken from the refreshment tent about 10 minutes before he collapsed. Gladys Leach poured it from the large urn in front of several witnesses. The urn itself has been tested, nothing, which suggests the poison was added to the individual cup afterwards." Miss Marple nodded. "Or to the sugar, perhaps. Mr. Harrington took 3 spoons, Gladys told me." "Exactly. We're examining the sugar bowl now. The difficulty is opportunity. Almost anyone at the fête could have approached the side table where the cups were waiting." "And motive?" she inquired gently. Craddock permitted himself a small grimace. "Rather too many candidates. The 4 most obvious are Thomas Hartley, Miss Laura Greenshaw, Captain Robert Ainsworth, and Mrs. Price Ridley. Each had recent cause for serious grievance. Each was present yesterday. Each claims to have been occupied elsewhere at the crucial time." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Alibis, Inspector? How very convenient. One always finds them so illuminating." Craddock smiled in spite of himself. "I thought you might like to hear them at first hand. I'm on my way to interview them now. If you happen to be taking your constitutional in the same direction." Miss Marple reached for her hat, a neat straw with a modest ribbon, and her umbrella. "What a sensible suggestion. The fresh air will do me good." Their first call was upon young Tom Hartley, whom they found in the vicarage garden clipping the yew hedge with vigorous, rather unnecessary strokes of the shears. His sleeves were rolled high, revealing strong brown arms, and there was a faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool morning. When he saw the inspector, his jaw tightened, but he greeted Miss Marple with the respectful nod due to an old lady who tipped generously at Christmas. "Good morning, Tom," she said pleasantly. "Such a dreadful business yesterday. We were all most upset." Tom laid down the shears. "Aye, miss, terrible. Though I can't say I'm grieving over much. He was a nasty piece of work, was Harrington." "Tom!" Craddock's tone was warning. The young man flushed. "Begging your pardon, sir, but it's true. Accused me of stealing his precious rose cuttings in the middle of the King's Arms, loud enough for everyone to hear. I've never taken so much as a petal that wasn't mine, and now folk look at me sideways, wondering." "And yesterday afternoon?" Craddock asked. "I was at the coconut shy from 2 o'clock onwards. Dozens saw me. Mr. Clement the vicar, Mrs. Harmon from the post office, half the cricket team. I only left once for 5 minutes to fetch lemonade for the stall." Miss Marple observed the set of his shoulders, the quick defensiveness in his eyes. Anger, yes, but fear. She could not quite tell. They left him to his clipping and walked on toward Greenshaw's Folly, that extraordinary mock Gothic tower built by a whimsical ancestor and now inhabited by Miss Laura Greenshaw alone with her bulbs and her fierce independence. She received them in the stone-flagged hall, surrounded by trays of tulip bulbs labeled in meticulous copperplate. "Poison?" she said bluntly when Craddock explained their errand. "I'm not surprised. The man was poison himself, threatened to uproot my yew hedge, 300 years old, planted by Capability Brown's assistant, or so family legend has it. Said it obstructed his view. I told him I'd obstruct his view permanently if he tried." Her hawk-like eyes dared them to comment. "And yesterday?" Craddock prompted. "I was in the fortune-teller's booth from 1 o'clock until the commotion. Mrs. Harmon sat with me most of the time. She'll confirm it. I only stepped out briefly to fetch my shawl." Miss Marple noted the firmness of the chin, the absence of tremor in the long, capable hands. Miss Greenshaw was not a woman who frightened easily. Captain Ainsworth lived in a small red-brick cottage overlooking the duck pond. They found him polishing his collection of naval binoculars, a half-empty glass of whiskey at his elbow, though the hour was barely noon. "Damned bad show," he said gruffly, after offering them a drink which both refused. "Harrington was a bounder, cheated at cards if you ask me, but murder's not the way. Bad form altogether." He admitted the debt freely. £500. Owed it since Easter. He kept putting me off, said he'd settle next week. Made it deuced awkward. His alibi was the raffle stall. I was announcing the winning numbers from 2:30 onwards. Crowd around me the whole time. Ask anyone. Yet Miss Marple noticed a slight hesitation, a flick of the eyes toward the clock. Their final visit was to Mrs. Price Ridley, who inhabited a substantial Edwardian villa with a neatly graveled drive and beds of regimented salvias. She received them in her drawing room, seated very upright in a high-backed chair, her artificial cherries bobbing indignantly on her hat. "I have never been so shocked in my life," she declared. "To think that such a thing could happen at our little fete, and that anyone should imagine I could be involved is beyond comprehension." She had spent the critical period judging the children's painting competition in the school tent, she said. Miss Hartnell and the headmistress could vouch for her presence. "Though I did step out for a moment to speak to Mrs. Bantry about the tea-urn," she added with the air of one making a clean breast. "But only a moment." As they walked back down the high street, Inspector Craddock sighed. 4 suspects, 4 reasonably solid alibis, 4 undeniable motives, and every one of them with a small, unaccounted-for gap in their movements. Miss Marple twirled her umbrella thoughtfully. "Precisely, Inspector. It is the gaps that interest me. A minute here, 5 minutes there, quite long enough in the bustle of a fete for someone to approach a teacup unobserved. And yet, one feels there is something missing. A connection, perhaps. Something we have all seen but not yet noticed." Craddock looked at her with the mixture of exasperation and admiration she had come to recognize. "You have an idea already." "Not an idea, my dear, merely a feeling, like the sensation one has when a stitch has been dropped in one's knitting. One knows something is wrong, but one must find exactly where." They parted at her gate, the inspector to his official duties, Miss Marple to a light luncheon of tomato soup and a resolve to pay a quiet visit to the tea tent later that afternoon. When the police had finished their measurements and the villagers had begun, cautiously, to return. Human nature, she reflected as she sipped her soup, was a patient thing. It would reveal itself in time, if one only watched carefully enough. Chapter 4. The Missing Teacup. By the 3rd day after the fete, St. Mary Mead had settled into that peculiar state of hushed excitement which follows an unsolved crime in a small community. The newspapers had descended briefly, 2 reporters from the Much Benham Gazette, and one enterprising young man from a London daily who had hoped for lurid details but left disappointed by the village's resolute gentility. The flower tent had been cleared, the crushed dahlias disposed of, and the green restored to its usual peaceful aspect. Yet an invisible cordon remained. Conversations paused when certain names were mentioned, and eyes followed strangers with wary curiosity. Inspector Craddock had established temporary headquarters in the vicarage study, a room normally reserved for parish accounts and the composing of sermons. He sat now at Mr. Clement's desk, surrounded by statements, a large-scale plan of the village green, and a tray of cooling coffee provided by the vicar's wife. His normally neat hair was slightly disheveled. The case was proving stubborn. The poison was definitely cyanide, he told Miss Marple when she called that afternoon with a small jar of her homemade blackcurrant jelly as a pretext. Prussic acid, to be precise. Fast-acting odor of bitter almonds noted by Dr. Haydock. No trace in the urn or the sugar bowl used for general servings. But we found something odd. He held up an evidence bag containing a delicate porcelain teacup, white with a fine blue rim. A hairline crack ran across the base and a faint brown stain marked the inside. This was discovered buried in a flower bed behind the tea tent, wrapped in a duster. It's from the WI's best service, the one reserved for special guests. Gladys remembers Harrington specifically asking for his usual cup shortly before the judging. He always insisted on this particular pattern, said it reminded him of his mother's tea set. Apparently, he brought his own sugar as well, kept a small silver box in his pocket because he disliked the granulated sort we use. Miss Marple examined the cup through the bag with interest. So the poison was almost certainly in this cup alone. Someone knew his preference and prepared it specially. Exactly. And then hid the evidence. The crack suggests it was dropped in haste, perhaps when the alarm was raised. A diversion had appeared that morning in the shape of a missing silver teapot, part of the Bantry family crest set Lent for the occasion. It had vanished from the refreshment table during the confusion following the collapse. Mrs. Bantry was distraught. Colonel Bantry, returned from his regimental dinner, had spent the morning telephoning acquaintances in case it had been tidied away by mistake. Robbery as well as murder? Craddock mused. It's possible. The teapot is worth £100 or more. But it feels opportunistic. Almost too convenient. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the plan of the green spread before them. Or perhaps a distraction, Inspector. A red herring, as fishermen say. While everyone thinks of theft, the real clue, the poisoned cup, is overlooked. Craddock rubbed his chin. There's another development. We searched Tom Hartley's shed yesterday. Routine given the accusation of theft against him. Found a packet of cyanide-based pesticide half empty, used for wasps' nests, he claims, and several other gardeners confirm they use the same brand. But it's suggestive. Miss Marple inclined her head. Very suggestive. Almost too much so, one might think. Young men do not usually leave incriminating evidence lying about for the police to find quite so handily. She took her leave soon after, promising to think the matter over, and directed her steps toward the high street. Her first port of call was the post office, where Mrs. Harmon, the postmistress, was sorting letters with the absorbed concentration of one who knew every correspondent's secrets. A dreadful business, Miss Marple, Mrs. Harmon greeted her. And now that poor boy Tom under suspicion. Though between you and me, I'm not surprised someone did for Harrington. The way he spoke to people. Only last month he told Miss Greenshaw her tulips were common as muck. Miss Marple purchased a book of stamps she did not particularly need, and lingered over the display of birthday cards. I wondered if you had noticed anything unusual on the day of the fête, Mrs. Harmon. You were helping in the fortune-teller's booth with Miss Greenshaw, I believe." Mrs. Harmon leaned forward confidentially. "Well, now you mention it, I did see something. Just before the judging started, I popped out for a breath of air and I saw Mrs. Price Ridley near the flower tent. Bending over Mr. Harrington's body she was, or so it seemed. Gave me quite a turn when I heard he'd been poisoned." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Dear me. Though I suppose in the confusion many people approached the poor man." "Perhaps," Mrs. Harmon conceded, "but she looked furtive, and then she hurried away when she saw me watching." From the post office, Miss Marple proceeded to the King's Arms, where old Mr. Pye, the landlord, was polishing glasses with meditative slowness. He confirmed that Captain Ainsworth had been in for a quick one around midday, but had left in plenty of time for raffle duties. "Mind you," Mr. Pye added, lowering his voice, though the bar was empty, "the captain's been looking pinched lately. Money troubles, they say. Harrington had him on a string with that card dead." By tea-time, Miss Marple had gathered a rich harvest of village opinion. The missing teapot pointed to Captain Ainsworth, desperate for funds. The pesticide, packet damn Tom Hartley. Mrs. Price Ridley's furtive behavior cast suspicion on her prideful soul. Even Miss Greenshaw's absence from the fortune-teller's booth for a shawl had grown in retrospect to a suspicious quarter hour. Yet as she sat in her small drawing room with a cup of lapsang souchong, Miss Marple felt increasingly certain that these were precisely what they appeared: distractions. The teapot would turn up innocently misplaced. The pesticide was too obvious. The bending over the body too easily explained by concern or curiosity. No, the key lay in the broken teacup and the special sugar. Someone who knew Harrington's habits intimately, knew he would ask for that particular cup, knew he took 3 spoons from his own supply, had prepared the poison with care and then hidden the evidence in panic when the crack betrayed them. She recalled watching the side table being set that morning. Mrs. Bantry had been bustling everywhere, but others had helped. Captain Ainsworth arranging spoons, Mrs. Price Ridley criticizing the placement of cakes, Tom Hartley delivering crates of lemonade, even Miss Greenshaw dropping off a tray of her prized scones as a peace offering after their latest row. Any of them could have placed the cup ready. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her own favorite spode unchipped, and gazed out at her neat garden. Somewhere in those seemingly innocent actions lay the truth. But the picture was still incomplete, threads tangled where they should align. A soft knock sounded at the door. It was Gladys, the tea-tent server, twisting her hands in her apron again. "Please, miss," she said breathlessly. "I've remembered something. About the sugar bowl on the side table, the little silver one Mr. Harrington brought himself. After he collapsed, I went to clear things and it was gone. I thought it had been tidied away, but no one's seen it since." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Thank you, Gladys. That is most helpful." Another piece. The murderer had taken not only the cup, but the poisoned sugar container. As Gladys left, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. The pattern was emerging slowly like a photograph in developing fluid. But patience was required. The village would reveal its secrets only in its own time. Outside, the evening light slanted golden across the roses, and somewhere a blackbird began its evensong. St. Mary Mead prepared for another peaceful night, peaceful on the surface at least. Chapter 5. Garden Secrets. The 4th day broke cool and bright with a breeze that carried the scent of cut grass and distant wood smoke across the village. Miss Marple, who rose early however little sleep she had enjoyed, was already in her garden by 7:30. She moved slowly between the borders, deadheading the roses with the small pair of secateurs she kept in her apron pocket. It was a task that required no great concentration, and therefore left the mind free to wander where it would, along the narrow paths of motive and opportunity that had opened since Mr. Harrington's collapse. She had decided to pay a quiet visit to the manor house on the hill. The house itself, Harrington Manor as the new owner had rather grandly renamed it, was a solid, ugly Victorian pile that had stood empty for years before Harrington bought it. The gardens, however, were another matter. Even from the lane one could see the regimented rows of hybrid teas, the immaculate pergolas heavy with climbers, the greenhouse that glinted like a crystal palace in the morning sun. It was a garden created to impress rather than to comfort, and it had impressed the village into a mixture of admiration and resentment. The daily housekeeper, Mrs. Eccles, admitted Miss Marple with the air of one grateful for any distraction from grief and suspicion. The police had already searched the house, she confided, but had taken nothing away except a few papers. Mr. Harrington's nephew and heir, a pale young man from London, was expected tomorrow. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea in the morning room and asked, with the gentle diffidence that never failed to disarm, whether she might look at the greenhouse. "I have always been interested in Mr. Harrington's methods," she explained. "His roses were quite remarkable." Mrs. Eccles, flattered that anyone should still admire her late employer's handiwork, fetched the key herself. The greenhouse was even larger than it appeared from outside. Heat and the heavy sweetness of blooms pressed upon the visitor like a living thing. Row upon row of plants stood on slatted benches, each labeled in Harrington's precise copperplate: Peace, Crimson Glory, Madam Butterfly, Ena Harkness. Beneath the benches, sacks of fertilizer and trays of seedlings waited in orderly array. Miss Marple walked slowly, umbrella tapping softly on the brick floor, her eyes taking in every detail. She paused at a small locked cupboard set into the wall. The door stood slightly ajar. The police had forced it yesterday. Inside were the poisons a serious rose grower requires: nicotine wash, Darris dust, and on the lowest shelf a squat brown bottle labeled hydrocyanic acid for photographic use, extreme caution. A neat red sticker warned poison in capital letters. The bottle was half empty. Miss Marple regarded it thoughtfully. Cyanide for darkening silver prints, quite usual in the days when gentlemen still developed their own photographs. And here it had sat within easy reach of anyone who knew the cupboard's simple catch. She closed the door gently and moved on. In a corner stood a small table bearing a spirit kettle, a packet of biscuits, and a single cup and saucer, white china with a blue rim. Exactly like the cracked cup found behind the tea tent. Mrs. Eccles, hovering behind her, noticed the direction of her gaze. "That was Mr. Harrington's private tea corner," she explained. "He liked to take a cup when he was working in here. Always used his own things. Said the maids never washed them properly." Miss Marple nodded. So the habit of the special cup was long-standing. And the sugar? She opened the small drawer beneath the table. Inside lay a silver sugar caster dented with age, and a spoon. The caster still held a quantity of fine white crystals. "Would you mind if I borrowed this spoon for a moment?" she asked mildly. "I believe I have one very similar at home and should like to compare them." Mrs. Eccles, bewildered but trusting, handed it over. On her way back through the village, Miss Marple called at Dr. Haydock's surgery. The doctor was between patients and greeted her with the rueful smile of a man who had slept badly. "I suppose you want to know about cyanide," he said, waving her to a chair. "Nasty stuff. A few grains in solution, death within minutes. Smell of bitter almonds on the breath, though not everyone can detect it. Harrington had enough in him to kill a dozen men." "And the source?" she asked. "Could be almost anywhere. Garden pesticides, photographic darkrooms, certain industrial processes. We found traces in that broken cup, of course, dissolved in the dregs of the tea." Miss Marple produced the silver spoon from her handbag. "Would you be kind enough to test this for me, Doctor?" very discreetly. Haydock raised an eyebrow but took the spoon without comment. "I'll telephone you this evening," was all he said. Her next visit was to Miss Greenshaw at the Folly. The tall spinster was on her knees in a border of rare fritillaries, a masculine straw hat jammed firmly on her graying curls. "I suppose you've come about the poison," she said without preamble, sitting back on her heels. "Well, it wasn't me, though I won't pretend I'm sorry he's gone. The man was a vandal. Did you know he planned to fell my yew hedge next spring? Said it spoiled his view of the valley. 300 years, Miss Marple, 300 years. Miss Marple sympathized gently and asked whether Miss Greenshaw had noticed anyone near the tea tent during the fete. "Only half the village," was the robust reply. "But I did see young Tom Hartley carrying crates of lemonade past the side table not 10 minutes before the judging. Looked hot and bothered, he did." Tom again. Always Tom. From the Folly, Miss Marple walked to the small cottage where Captain Ainsworth lived. He was in his garden attempting to train a recalcitrant rambler rose, his pipe clenched between his teeth. "Afternoon, ma'am," he greeted her. "Come to pump the chief suspect, eh?" "I prefer to think of us all as witnesses," Miss Marple said mildly. "Tell me, Captain, did you happen to notice Mr. Harrington's silver sugar caster on the day of the fete? I believe he carried it in his pocket." Ainsworth knocked out his pipe on the fence post. "Can't say I did, though now you mention it, he was fishing for something in his waistcoat just before he went to judge. Dropped his handkerchief, I remember, clumsy beggar." A small thing, but Miss Marple tucked it away. By late afternoon she was home again, arranging the day's observations like pieces on a patience board. The greenhouse cupboard, the private tea corner, the identical cup and spoon, the missing sugar caster, the dropped handkerchief, each apparently insignificant, yet together they formed a pattern. When Dr. Haydock telephoned at 7 o'clock, his voice was puzzled. "That spoon you sent? Traces of cyanide in the crevices of the handle. Not enough to kill, but unmistakable. Where on earth did you find it?" "In Mr. Harrington's own greenhouse," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Thank you, Doctor. You have been most helpful." She replaced the receiver and sat for a long time gazing at her neat little garden, where the evening light lay soft upon the lavender. The picture was almost complete now. Almost, but not quite. One more thread was needed, the thread that would tie the special cup, the private sugar, and the careless dropping of a handkerchief into a single deadly knot. Outside, the church clock struck the quarter. Somewhere in the village, a murderer was dining peacefully, confident that suspicion still swirled harmlessly among 4 obvious targets. Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Patience, she reminded herself. The truth was like a bulb planted in autumn. It would push through in its own time, delicate but irresistible. Chapter 6. The Fortune Teller's Hint. On the 5th morning after the tragedy, a soft drizzle veiled St. Mary Mead, turning the lanes to glossy ribbons and filling the air with the clean scent of wet earth. Miss Marple, undeterred by the weather, donned her plastic rain hood and her stoutest shoes and set out for a gentle walk that would, by apparently happy accident, take her past several points of interest. Her first destination was the village hall, where the fete committee's leftover equipment still awaited collection. The fortune teller's booth, a small tent of faded crimson silk decorated with mysterious moons and stars, had been folded away in one corner. The traveling Romany woman who had occupied it, Madame Zara, was due to leave that afternoon. Miss Marple felt it prudent to have a word before she departed. Madame Zara was packing her crystal ball into a nest of velvet when Miss Marple arrived. She was a handsome woman of indeterminate age, with dark eyes that seemed to hold both amusement and sorrow in equal measure. "Ah, the wise lady of the village," Madame Zara greeted her, with a flash of gold teeth. You wish to know who poisoned the proud gentleman with the loud voice? Miss Marple smiled gently. I wish only to thank you for your contribution to our little fete. The children were enchanted, though I wondered whether, in the course of your observations, you noticed anything unusual near the tea tent. Madame Zara paused, wrapping a pack of tarot cards in silk. Many things are unusual at a village fete, madam. So much envy wrapped in smiles. But yes, I saw something. A lady in a green hat, pale green like new leaves, stood by the side table where the special cups waited. She lingered longer than necessary. Her eyes were angry like storm clouds. She wore gloves, though the day was warm. Mrs. Price Ridley had worn a pale green hat with her beige costume, Miss Marple recalled, and gloves despite the sunshine. But then so had several other ladies of a certain age who considered bare hands common. Thank you, Miss Marple said quietly. You have been most observant. From the hall she proceeded to the post office, where a small queue had formed. Mrs. Harmon, serving behind the grill, was full of the latest development. 3 anonymous letters had arrived that morning at the police station, all accusing Tom Hartley in crude block capitals. The envelopes were cheap, the paper sold in every stationer's for miles around. Someone trying to throw dust in the eyes of the police, Mrs. Harmon declared. Though I must say, poor Tom hasn't helped himself. He was seen arguing with Mr. Harrington only the day before the fete, shouting about those rose cuttings again. Miss Marple purchased another unnecessary book of stamps and asked casually whether anyone had noticed Captain Ainsworth's movements more closely. Well now, Mrs. Harmon lowered her voice. Old Mr. Peterson from the forge says the captain stepped away from the raffle stall for a good 10 minutes just before the judging. Said he was checking the refreshments. 10 minutes. Quite long enough. At the King's Arms, Mr. Pye confirmed that Miss Greenshaw had come in briefly for a glass of lemonade, unusual for her as she rarely patronized the public bar, and had asked the time rather pointedly. And Mrs. Price Ridley, he added, polishing a tankard, was in here complaining about the Indian tea blend not 5 minutes after Harrington collapsed. Said it was far too bitter for her taste. A small thing, but Miss Marple tucked it away with the others. By early afternoon the drizzle had ceased, and she found herself at the vicarage where Mrs. Clement was arranging flowers for Sunday in the cool stone porch. I am quite distracted, Miss Marple, the vicar's wife confessed. First the church roof fund triumphs, then this dreadful shadow, and now they say the poison came from Mr. Harrington's own greenhouse. Anyone might have taken it. The door is never locked in daytime. Miss Marple sympathized and inquired whether the vicar had noticed anything amiss during the fete. Only that young Gladys seemed terribly flustered, Mrs. Clement replied. She told me afterwards that Mr. Harrington had complained about the taste of his tea, said it was oddly bitter, but drank it anyway because he was thirsty, and then, just before the collapse, he dropped his handkerchief while reaching for his sugar caster. Bent to pick it up, and when he straightened, his face was already changing color. Dropped his handkerchief. The second mention of that small mishap. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her umbrella furled but still in hand like a staff. The pieces were assembling themselves with increasing clarity. The special cup always requested, the private caster of fine sugar carried in the pocket, the handkerchief dropped at the crucial moment. The bitterness noticed yet ignored in the heat of the afternoon and the importance of the judging. Someone had known Harrington would bend to retrieve his handkerchief, known because they had arranged for it to fall, perhaps with a surreptitious tug or a breath of air from a passing hand. In that brief second when his attention was lowered, a few grains of poisoned sugar could have been tipped into the caster from a folded paper hidden in a gloved palm. The murderer had not needed to approach the cup after it was poured. The poison had been in the sugar all along, ready for Harrington to administer himself with his usual 3 generous spoons. It was clever, subtle, and entirely safe, provided no one noticed the substitution. But someone had noticed the bitterness, and someone had seen a lady in a green hat lingering by the side table, and someone had taken away the empty caster afterwards in the confusion. Miss Marple reached her gate and paused to admire a late-blooming rose that had defied the rain. Human vanity, she reflected, was a powerful force. A slight to one's roses, a public humiliation over a cake or a garden show. These could fester as deeply as any grander passion. She thought of parallels. A woman in another village years ago who had poisoned her sister's tea over an inheritance that was, in truth, quite modest. Another who had used weed killer because a neighbor's cat persistently fouled her prize borders. Small causes, deadly effects. That evening, Inspector Craddock called, looking weary. "We've recovered the silver sugar caster," he said without preamble. "Buried in the same flower bed as the broken cup, traces of cyanide in the residue. And the missing teapot turned up behind the coconut shy, hidden by one of the schoolboys for a prank, apparently. So much for robbery." Miss Marple offered him a slice of seed cake and listened as he recounted the anonymous letters. "Someone is trying rather too hard to direct us toward Tom Hartley," he said. "Which suggests, perhaps, that he is innocent. Or that the murderer is particularly cunning," Miss Marple murmured. "But I think, Inspector, we are nearing the end. There is only one person who combines intimate knowledge of Mr. Harrington's habits with a motive that, though it seems trivial to us, would feel mortal to the murderer." Craddock looked at her sharply. "You know who it is?" "I believe I do, but one must be certain. A few more quiet inquiries tomorrow, perhaps. And then a little gathering to clear the air." She would invite the principal players to tea at her cottage the day after next. Nothing formal, just a few friends to discuss the church roof fund and put the unfortunate incident behind them. Craddock recognized the gleam in her pale blue eyes and sighed. "I suppose I shall be invited too." "Of course, Inspector. You will find it most instructive." Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady on the thatched roof. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like quiet clockwork. The pattern was almost complete now. Only the final row remained to be cast off. Chapter 7. The Broken Alibi. The morning of the 6th day brought a return of summer warmth, as though the weather itself wished to coax the village back into its usual rhythms. Windows stood open, bees droned among the hollyhocks, and the scent of fresh-baked bread drifted from the bakery on the high street. Yet beneath this placid surface, tension coiled like a watch spring. Inspector Craddock's quiet inquiries had begun to bear fruit, and the 4 principal suspects felt the net tightening, each in their different way. Miss Marple spent the early hours in her garden tying up the sweet peas that had been battered by the recent rain. It was gentle work that allowed her thoughts to settle. By the time the church clock struck 10, she had decided upon her next moves. She would pay one more round of calls, this time not to gather fresh information but to observe reactions when certain small discrepancies were gently probed. Her first visit was to Captain Ainsworth. She found him on the small jetty by the duck pond, feeding stale crusts to a hopeful mallard. His pipe was unlit, and there were dark shadows beneath his eyes. "Good morning, Captain," she said pleasantly. "Such a lovely day again. One almost forgets the shadow over us all." Ainsworth gave a short, humorless laugh. "Almost, ma'am, though I confess I shan't forget it until this business is cleared up. Damned unpleasant being looked at sideways by one's neighbors." Miss Marple sat on the bench beside him, arranging her umbrella across her knees. "I dare say the police are simply being thorough. They mentioned to me that your raffle announcements were most admired. Everyone agrees you were at the microphone almost continuously. Though there was one short interval, I believe, when you stepped away. The captain's hand paused midway to his pocket for matches. 10 minutes, perhaps. Had to check the refreshment stocks. Mrs. Bantry was worried we might run short of cups. Perfectly innocent. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. And yet it does leave a small gap. One understands how these things prey on the mind. Ainsworth lit his pipe at last, puffing rather harder than necessary. Gap? Nonsense. Half a dozen people saw me come and go. But Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of the jaw, the quick glance toward the water. A gap indeed. She proceeded next to Greenshaw's folly. Miss Greenshaw was in her potting shed, pricking out seedlings with fierce concentration. When Miss Marple mentioned the fortune-teller's booth, the spinster looked up sharply. Mrs. Harmon has confirmed I was there the entire time, she said brusquely. Except for the few minutes I stepped out for my shawl. Hardly enough to poison a man and hide the evidence. Quite, Miss Marple agreed, though Madame Zara did mention seeing someone lingering by the tea things. A lady in a green hat. Miss Greenshaw snorted. Half the Women's Institute wears green in summer. Pointless tittle-tattle. Yet her hand, holding the dibber, trembled very slightly. Tom Hartley was harder to find. He was working at the far end of the manor gardens, clearing a border that Harrington had intended for a new rose bed. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and there was a sullen set to his shoulders. "I've had the police round again," he said bitterly when Miss Marple approached. "More questions about that blasted pesticide. As if I'd be fool enough to leave it lying about if I'd used it on a man." "A frame, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested mildly, "though your movements that afternoon delivering lemonade crates past the side table just before the judging do place you conveniently near." Tom drove his spade into the earth with unnecessary force. "I was back at the coconut shy in 5 minutes flat. Ask anyone." But his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple recalled the quick temper that had flared so often under Harrington's taunts. Her final call was upon Mrs. Price Ridley, who was arranging gladioli in a tall vase in her drawing room with the precision of a drill sergeant. The artificial cherries on her hat seemed to quiver with indignation even before she spoke. "I hear the most scandalous rumors," she began without preamble. "That I was seen bending over the body, absolute nonsense. I merely stooped to adjust a fallen bloom, Dahlia's bruise so easily. And as for lingering by the tea tent, I was merely ensuring the cakes were properly displayed." Miss Marple accepted a cup of rather strong coffee and inquired gently about the pale green hat. "I wore beige on the day," Mrs. Price Ridley declared. "Beige costume, beige hat. Green is not my color." Yet Miss Marple noticed on the hat stand in the hall as she left a pale green straw with a darker ribbon, damp still as though recently brushed clean after rain. By tea time she was home again, and Inspector Craddock arrived soon after, his notebook fuller than ever. "Every alibi has cracked," he reported with grim satisfaction. "Ainsworth was away from the raffle for 12 minutes, not 5. Miss Greenshaw's absence from the booth was nearer 15. Hartley was seen returning to the coconut shy, flushed and hurried, and Mrs. Price Ridley left the children's painting tent twice, once for nearly 10 minutes, claiming to fetch water for the judges." He spread witness statements on Miss Marple's table like a hand of cards. "And there's more. A gardener at the manor confirms the greenhouse cupboard was open that morning. Anyone might have taken the cyanide. We found a lady's glove in the flower bed near where the cup and castor were buried. Kid leather slightly scented with bitter almond hand lotion." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Bitter almond. How very suggestive. Craddock leaned forward. "You suspected the sugar castor from the beginning." "I suspected the sugar," she corrected gently. Mr. Harrington's own fine castor sugar, into which the poison was introduced earlier, perhaps even the night before. He carried it in his pocket, you see, and refilled it from a larger stock in his greenhouse. The murderer needed only to substitute poisoned sugar for ordinary during a moment when the castor was set down. Perhaps during one of his frequent boasts in the tea tent, when he laid it on the side table with his handkerchief. Craddock nodded slowly. And the dropped handkerchief at the crucial moment. Deliberate distraction. Precisely. A breath across the pocket or a passing hand brushing the handkerchief so that it fluttered to the ground. While Harrington bent to retrieve it, the substitution was made. He then sweetened his own tea generously as always and sealed his fate. But who? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Tomorrow, Inspector. I have invited them all to tea here at 4 o'clock, ostensibly to discuss reopening the church roof fund. Mrs. Bantry will pour, and you shall be in the kitchen, out of sight but within call. One of them will betray themselves when the pieces are laid before them. Craddock looked doubtful. You are certain? As certain as one can be in these matters. The glove will be the final touch. I took the liberty of borrowing its pair from a certain hat stand this afternoon. It will be returned, of course, after tomorrow. She rose to see him out. At the door she paused. There is one more thing. Dr. Haydock detected the faint almond scent on Mrs. Price Ridley's glove found in the flower bed. She uses a hand cream scented with bitter almond oil, most exclusive from a London chemist. Vanity, you see. She could not bear ordinary lavender like the rest of us. Craddock stared at her. Mrs. Price Ridley? But her motive, garden rivalry, a slight about her roses, is the strongest of all, Miss Marple finished quietly. To her, social standing in St. Mary Mead is everything. Harrington had discovered she substituted bought blooms for her own in last year's county show. A trifling cheat, but fatal to her pride. He threatened exposure unless she withdrew from this year's competition. For Mrs. Price Ridley, that humiliation would have been unbearable. The inspector shook his head in reluctant admiration. You never cease to astonish me, Miss Marple. She smiled serenely. Human nature seldom does, Inspector. It is so very predictable once one recognizes the pattern. As he left, she returned to her sitting room and took from her bag the pale green hat she had borrowed. On the inside band, almost invisible, was a tiny monogram, EPR. Tomorrow would see the end of it. Outside, the sun slanted low across the meadows, gilding the church spire. St. Mary Mead prepared for another tranquil evening, unaware that on the morrow its most carefully guarded secret would be laid bare over tea and scones. Chapter 8. The Gathering Storm. The afternoon chosen for Miss Marple's tea party was one of those perfect English summer days that seemed designed to mock human distress. Roses nodded in the breeze. The sky arched cloudless and blue, and from the open windows of her cottage drifted the faint scent of freshly baked scones and strawberry jam. Inside, the small sitting room had been arranged with careful informality. A round table covered with a lace cloth, the best spode cups laid out, a plate of thinly cut cucumber sandwiches, and a silver hot water jug gleaming beside the teapot. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, bustling and pink-cheeked, ready to act as hostess and pour. She had been told only that Jane wished to put the unpleasantness behind us and restart the church roof appeal. Inspector Craddock was already concealed in the kitchen, the door ajar just enough for him to hear every word. One by one the guests appeared. Captain Ainsworth came promptly at 4 in a clean blazer and freshly pressed flannels, his limp a little more pronounced than usual. He greeted Mrs. Bantry with old-fashioned courtesy and accepted a cup of tea with murmured thanks. Miss Greenshaw arrived next, striding up the path in her tweeds and brogues as though marching to battle. She carried a small posy of rare auriculas for the hostess and sat stiffly on the edge of her chair, refusing sugar with a brusque shake of the head. Tom Hartley hesitated at the gate before stepping in, cap in hand, his face sullen beneath the tan. He perched uncomfortably on the sofa, declining everything except a glass of water. Last came Mrs. Price Ridley, sailing through the door in a rustle of silk, wearing her beige costume and the pale green hat that had been returned discreetly by Miss Marple's daily woman that morning. She carried a small parcel wrapped in tissue. "A little offering for the fund," she explained, placing it on the table with a meaning smile. Miss Marple, fluffy and gentle in pink wool, presided from her armchair like a benign spider at the center of a delicate web. "How kind of you all to come," she began, her voice soft and fluttering. "After such a dreadful week, I felt we needed to remind ourselves that life in St. Mary Mead goes on. The church roof will not mend itself, and poor Mr. Harrington's sad end must not be allowed to overshadow our community spirit." Mrs. Bantry poured tea with a lavish hand. Conversation began haltingly. The weather, the prospects for the cricket match against Much Benham, the price of strawberries this year. But an undercurrent ran beneath every word, an awareness of why they were truly gathered. Miss Marple let the small talk drift for 10 minutes before she leaned forward, her pale blue eyes resting on each face in turn. "I have been thinking a great deal about what happened," she said quietly. "Such a clever crime in its way. So much care taken to mislead." Captain Ainsworth cleared his throat. "Mislead? The police seem convinced it was poison. Hardly a matter of misdirection." "But it was, Captain. The pesticide in Tom's shed, the anonymous letters, even the missing teapot, all planted to point suspicion in obvious directions, while the real method was far subtler." Miss Greenshaw set her cup down with a click. "Method? I thought it was simply cyanide in the tea." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not in the tea, my dear. In the sugar. Mr. Harrington's own fine castor sugar, which he carried in his pocket and used generously. 3 spoons, always. The poison was introduced into that castor earlier in the day so that he administered it to himself quite innocently." Tom Hartley shifted uncomfortably. "But anyone could have done that if they got hold of the castor." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "And someone did. During the bustle of setting up the tea tent, when Mr. Harrington laid his castor on the side table while boasting about his roses. A quick substitution from a folded paper hidden in a gloved hand, and the deed was done." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a small, incredulous laugh. "Gloved? On such a warm day? How very melodramatic." Miss Marple turned to her with a mild smile. "Yet someone was wearing gloves, Mrs. Price Ridley, a lady in a green hat seen lingering by the side table. And later, a kid glove, scented faintly with bitter almond hand cream, was found near where the poisoned castor and broken cup were buried." Mrs. Price Ridley's hand flew to her throat. "I never wear green. And my hand cream is a private blend, nothing to do with almonds." "But it is, you see," Miss Marple said softly. "Bitter almond oil for the fragrance. Dr. Haydock confirmed the scent on the glove, and the matching glove, the pair to the one found, was on your hat stand yesterday. Monogrammed EPR." The room grew very still. Mrs. Bantry's teapot hovered mid-air. Captain Ainsworth frowned. "But the motive? Garden rivalry?" "Surely not." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost regretful. "More than rivalry, Captain. Mr. Harrington had discovered that Mrs. Price Ridley substituted purchased blooms for her own in last year's county show. A small deception, perhaps, but he threatened to expose it unless she withdrew from all future competitions. For a lady whose entire standing in the village rests upon her reputation as our finest gardener, that exposure would have been social ruin, unbearable." Mrs. Price Ridley rose abruptly, her chair scraping back. "This is outrageous. I shall consult my solicitor." But her voice faltered as Inspector Craddock stepped quietly from the kitchen doorway, notebook in hand. "I think, madam," he said evenly, "that it would be best if you accompanied me to the station. We still have the glove, the caster with traces of cyanide, and several witnesses who saw you near the side table at the crucial time." Mrs. Price Ridley looked wildly about the room. Miss Greenshaw stared at her in blunt astonishment. Tom Hartley's mouth had fallen open. Captain Ainsworth shook his head slowly as though waking from a dream. For a long moment she stood rigid, the artificial cherries on her hat trembling. Then, quite suddenly, the stiffness went out of her. She sank back into her chair, her face crumpling like a child's. "It was only meant to make him ill," she whispered. "Just ill enough to miss the judging. I never thought 3 spoons. Such a dose." Miss Marple regarded her with compassion but no surprise. "Vanity is a powerful force, my dear, and pride goeth before a fall, as the Bible says." Mrs. Price Ridley began to weep quietly into her handkerchief. Inspector Craddock moved forward and with gentle firmness helped her to her feet. As the door closed behind them, Mrs. Bantry let out a long breath. "Well, Jane, I always said you were clever, but this beats all." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly once more. It was simply a matter of noticing the small things, the special cup, the private sugar, the dropped handkerchief that distracted him at the fatal moment. Human nature is really very consistent. Outside, the summer sun continued to shine upon the peaceful village, as though nothing darker than a dropped stitch had ever disturbed its calm. Chapter 9. The Revelation in the Village Hall. The news of Mrs. Price Ridley's arrest spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness of summer lightning. By evening, every cottage door had heard the tale, and by the next morning the village wore an air of stunned relief, as though a long, threatening storm had finally broken and passed. The church roof fund received several anonymous donations. Guilt money, some whispered, from those who had gossiped too freely. Yet questions lingered. Motives had been discussed in hushed tones for days, but the precise mechanics of the crime remained a puzzle to most. Miss Marple, ever sensitive to the village's need for closure, suggested to the vicar that a short gathering in the village hall might clear the air once and for all. Mr. Clement, a gentle soul who disliked loose ends, agreed with alacrity. Thus, on a golden afternoon, 2 days after the tea at Miss Marple's cottage, the hall filled quietly with the principal figures of the drama. Rows of folding chairs had been set out as though for a lecture, and sunlight slanted through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. Inspector Craddock stood at the front beside a small table covered with a green baize cloth. Upon it lay the exhibits: the cracked teacup, the silver sugar caster, the kid glove, and a folded handkerchief. Mrs. Price Ridley was not present. She had been taken to Much Benham for formal charging. But Captain Ainsworth, Miss Greenshaw, Tom Hartley, Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and a dozen other interested villagers filled the seats. Miss Marple sat in the front row, knitting placidly, her pale blue eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. Mr. Clement opened proceedings with a short prayer for understanding and forgiveness, then invited Inspector Craddock to speak. The inspector cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to information received." His glance flicked briefly to Miss Marple. "We have concluded our inquiries into Mr. Harrington's death. Miss Marple has kindly agreed to explain the sequence of events as she pieced them together." A murmur rippled through the hall. All eyes turned to the fluffy old lady in pink wool. Miss Marple rose, laying her knitting carefully on the chair. Her voice, though soft, carried effortlessly to the back row. "Thank you, Inspector. It is always sad when a crime is committed among friends and neighbors, but it is better that the truth be known. Let me take you back to the morning of the fête. Mr. Harrington was a creature of habit. He disliked the coarse granulated sugar provided at public functions and always carried his own fine castor sugar in a small silver box. He took 3 heaped spoons in every cup of tea, a strong, sweet brew. He also insisted on using a particular pattern of cup, white with a blue rim, because it reminded him of his childhood. These habits were well known to anyone who had observed him closely over the 2 years he lived among us. And one person had observed him very closely indeed. She paused, letting the silence settle. The murderer prepared the poison in advance, cyanide from Mr. Harrington's own greenhouse cupboard, where he kept chemicals for his photographic hobby. A small quantity was mixed with fine sugar identical to his own. On the morning of the fête, while the tea tent was being set up and Mr. Harrington was boasting about his roses to anyone who would listen, he placed his castor on the side table beside his handkerchief. In that brief moment of distraction, the poisoned sugar was substituted for the harmless contents of the castor. Later, when Gladys poured his tea, he asked for his usual cup, the blue-rimmed one waiting on the side table. He then sweetened it generously himself, as always. But as he reached for the castor, his handkerchief was caused to flutter to the ground, perhaps by a discreet breath or a passing gloved hand. While he bent to retrieve it, the final touch was added. A few extra grains tipped in to ensure lethality. He stirred, drank, and within minutes the fast-acting poison took effect. Captain Ainsworth stirred. But the bitterness! He complained of it. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, cyanide has a faint almond taste, but Mr. Harrington was thirsty, the day was warm, and he was eager to begin judging. He dismissed it as the strong Indian blend and drank anyway. 3 full spoons, more than enough, Miss Greenshaw spoke gruffly. And the broken cup? The buried castor? Panic, Miss Marple replied simply. When the alarm was raised, the murderer realized the special cup and castor would be examined. In the confusion, they were seized, but in haste the cup was dropped and cracked. Both were hurriedly buried in a nearby flower bed, along with the incriminating glove. The missing teapot and the pesticide in Tom's shed were later additions, crude attempts to direct suspicion elsewhere. Tom Hartley flushed deeply but said nothing. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. And the scent on the glove? Bitter almond hand cream, Miss Marple said. A luxury item used by only one person here. Combined with the monogram and the witness who saw a lady in a pale green hat lingering by the side table, it pointed unmistakably to Mrs. Price Ridley. Mrs. Bantry gave a small gasp. But the motive? Surely not just garden pride? Miss Marple's expression grew grave. To most of us, perhaps trivial. But Mrs. Price Ridley's entire position in the village rested upon her reputation as our finest amateur gardener. When Mr. Harrington discovered she had cheated in last year's county show, substituting professional blooms for her own, he threatened to expose her unless she withdrew from all future competitions. For her, that public humiliation would have been unbearable, a small vanity perhaps, but deadly in its consequences. She sat down amid a profound hush. Inspector Craddock stepped forward again. Mrs. Price Ridley has confessed. The case is closed. Mr. Clement rose to pronounce a brief benediction, and the gathering broke up slowly. Villagers filed out into the sunshine, talking quietly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others offering shy words of thanks to Miss Marple as they passed. Captain Ainsworth paused beside her. Remarkable, ma'am, though I confess I feel rather a fool for not seeing it. We none of us saw it clearly, Miss Marple replied gently, until the pattern emerged. Miss Greenshaw muttered something about damned foolishness over flowers and strode away. Tom Hartley lingered longest, cap in hand. Thank you, miss, he said awkwardly. For clearing my name, Miss Marple smiled. Justice is everyone's concern, Tom. As the hall emptied, Mrs. Bantry linked arms with her old friend. Jane, you are quite wonderful, but tell me, truly, when did you first suspect her? Miss Marple considered. When I noticed the bitter almond scent mentioned by more than one witness and realized only one person used that hand cream. The rest followed like knitting, one stitch leading naturally to the next. Outside, the summer day continued serene, the church spire rising calm against the sky. St. Mary Mead had weathered another storm, and life, as it always did, would resume its gentle rhythm. Chapter 10. Tea and Resolution. A week after the gathering in the village hall, St. Mary Mead had slipped back into its familiar, comforting rhythm. The summer fete was already becoming one of those stories told with a shake of the head and a half-smile. Do you remember the year poor Mr. Harrington dropped dead among the dahlias? And the church roof fund, swelled by a sudden spate of generous donations, was at last assured. On a tranquil morning fragrant with the scent of newly mown grass, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage drawing-room with a select company. Mrs. Bantry, Inspector Craddock, Dr. Haydock, and the vicar himself. A tray of tea and Mrs. Clement's excellent Madeira cake rested on the low table before them. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, laying soft patterns on the worn Persian rug. Mrs. Bantry, still flushed with the excitement of it all, leaned forward eagerly. Now, Jane, you simply must tell us properly, every detail. We've heard the outline, but I want to know how you saw it when the rest of us were completely bamboozled. Miss Marple accepted a second slice of cake with a murmured thank you and settled back in her chair, her pale blue eyes twinkling. It was really very simple, Dolly, once one looked at the small things rather than the large dramatic ones. So often in these matters we search for grand motives, money, passion, revenge on a grand scale, when the truth lies in something quite petty. Inspector Craddock smiled. Petty to us, perhaps, but not to Mrs. Price Ridley. Exactly, Miss Marple agreed. Her whole position in the village rested upon being considered our premier gardener. When Mr. Harrington discovered her little deception at the county show, buying prize blooms and passing them off as her own, he saw an opportunity to assert his superiority once and for all. He threatened exposure unless she withdrew from competition. For her, that was intolerable. Dr. Haydock nodded. Pride can be a dangerous thing. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The method followed naturally from Mr. Harrington's own habits. He disliked ordinary sugar and always carried his silver castor filled with fine crystals. He took 3 heaped spoons, more than enough to conceal a fatal dose of cyanide. The poison itself was readily available in his greenhouse. The murderer needed only to substitute poisoned sugar during the morning setup when the castor was momentarily unguarded on the side table. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, and the dropped handkerchief. A final touch of misdirection, Miss Marple replied. A discreet puff of breath or a gloved finger brushing the pocket caused the handkerchief to fall just as he reached for the castor after his tea was poured. While he bent to retrieve it, always courteous, you know, he did not notice the extra grains tipped in to ensure swift effect. The vicar shook his head gently. Such careful planning for such a small slight. Small slights fester deepest, Miss Marple said quietly. I have seen it before. A woman in another village once poisoned her neighbor's cat because it walked across her clean washing. Another put weed killer in a rival's prize marrow for much the same reason as Mrs. Price Ridley. Human vanity takes many forms. Craddock set down his cup. But the red herrings, the pesticide in Tom Hartley's shed, the anonymous letters, the hidden teapot, those were clever distractions. Rather too clever, Miss Marple said with a small smile. That was what first made me doubt the obvious suspects. Young men like Tom do not leave packets of poison lying about for anyone to find, and anonymous letters in block capitals are the mark of someone trying much too hard. The teapot, of course, was merely a schoolboy's prank. Children will hide things for the thrill of it. Mrs. Bantry chuckled. And all the while, the real clue was the special sugar and the bitter almond scent on the glove. Precisely. Once Dr. Haydock mentioned the almond odor, and I recalled that Mrs. Price Ridley alone used that exclusive hand cream. The pieces fell into place. The green hat seen by Madame Zara, the monogrammed glove buried with the evidence, the gaps in her alibi that allowed her to linger by the side table. Everything confirmed it. The vicar looked thoughtful. One hopes she will find peace in repentance. Miss Marple inclined her head. One always hopes, though I fear pride is a stubborn weed. Craddock rose to take his leave. Thanks to you, Miss Marple, the village can sleep easily again. Scotland Yard is grateful, though I doubt they'll ever quite believe an old lady in a deck chair solved it all while knitting. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Observation and experience, Inspector. And a little knowledge of human nature, which is, after all, very much the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or Mayfair. After the others had gone, Mrs. Bantry lingered, helping to stack the cups. You know, Jane, she said confidingly, I shall never look at a sugar caster in quite the same way again. Miss Marple laughed softly. Nor shall I, Dolly. But then one mustn't let these things spoil one's pleasure in a good cup of tea. Outside, the sun continued its slow journey across the sky, gilding the thatched roofs and the ancient church tower. Children's voices rose from the recreation ground, and somewhere a blackbird sang as though no darker thing than evening shadows had ever touched the village. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, settled into her favorite chair by the window, and picked up her knitting. The blue cardigan for her nephew's little girl was almost finished. Only the button band remained. Such a pleasant summer, she thought contentedly, watching the roses nod in the gentle breeze. And how very fortunate that everything had turned out so satisfactorily in the end.